candle burns so low that the wax has begun to spill across the carved oak table in slow white rivers. Outside the narrow window, the towers of King's Landing stand against a moonless sky, their outlines softened by mist rising from Blackwater Bay. Somewhere far below, a bell rings once, followed by the distant clatter of a cart crossing uneven stones. Then silence settles over the city again. The Red Keep breathes differently after midnight. Guards speak in whispers, servants move with lowered heads, and behind heavy doors, the greatest decisions in Westeros are often made by people who never draw a sword. This is where our journey begins, in the quiet hours when power hides behind candlelight instead of crowns. Tonight's tale is about a woman whose name has become almost synonymous with pride, cruelty, and ambition. Yet beneath those familiar judgments lies a more unsettling question. Why was Cersei Lannister the smartest player in the game for so many years? And why did even her greatest victories slowly become the foundations of her ruin? Settle in comfortably as we wander through the history of Westeros, moving slowly through the records left by maesters, the memories preserved in songs, and the pages of George R.R. Martin's written histories. And if you've joined these quiet journeys before, tell yourself which night you've reached. If this is your first visit, simply call it Night 1. The flame trembles as a draft slips beneath the chamber door. It catches the edge of a golden lion embroidered upon crimson silk, and for just a heartbeat the beast seems alive. That lion is older than Cersei herself. Long before she was born in 266 AC, House Lannister had ruled from Casterly Rock for thousands of years, claiming descent from the legendary Lan the Clever. Gold flowed endlessly from the mines beneath the western hills, making the Lannisters richer than every other great house in the Seven Kingdoms. Their wealth built castles, bought swords, arranged marriages, and shaped kings. By the time Cersei first opened her eyes, she entered a family that believed power was not merely possessed, it was inherited, protected, and never surrendered willingly. But here is the first mystery. If Cersei became one of the most formidable political minds in Westeros, why did almost no one recognize it while she was growing up? The answer begins not with Cersei herself, but with the man who stood above nearly everyone else in the realm after the fall of House Targaryen. Her father, Tywin Lannister, had already earned his reputation decades earlier. As Lord of Casterly Rock, he restored discipline after the weakness of his own father, Lord Tytos Lannister. Houses Rhaen and Tarbeck challenged Lannister authority, and Tywin answered with overwhelming force, destroying both rebellious families so completely that the Rains of Castamere became a warning sung throughout Westeros. Every noble house understood its meaning. Defiance against House Lannister carried a terrible price. Children raised beneath such a father rarely enjoyed ordinary childhoods. Tywin measured nearly everything by usefulness. He admired competence, despised weakness, and believed emotion should always kneel before duty. His eldest son, Jaime, was groomed to inherit Casterly Rock until circumstance altered that future. Tyrion, born much later, carried the burden of his father's resentment after Joanna Lannister died giving birth to him. Cersei occupied an unusual place between them. She possessed the pride Tywin respected, the sharp memory he valued, and the fierce confidence he himself displayed before courts and councils. Yet she was also a daughter. And in the political traditions of Westeros, daughters were expected to strengthen their houses through marriage rather than governance. That expectation shaped every corridor she walked. While boys learned warfare openly, noble girls were taught music, heraldry, household management, and courtly behavior. Cersei mastered those lessons, but she also listened whenever great lords discussed alliances, debts, harvests, or succession. Martin's novels repeatedly show that she remembered conversations others assumed children ignored. She watched Tywin receive bannermen from houses Crakehall, Lefford, Marbrand, and Brax. She observed how silence could force another lord to speak first. She learned that people often revealed themselves while trying to impress someone more powerful. No maester awarded lessons for such observations. They became valuable because Cersei collected them herself. The death that changed everything came in 273 AC. Joanna Lannister, beloved by both Tywin and the household of Casterly Rock, died giving birth to Tyrion. Canon tells us little about the private grief that followed inside those immense stone halls, yet its consequences echo throughout every later chapter. Tywin withdrew into even greater severity. Tyrion grew beneath the shadow of blame he never deserved. Jaime found himself increasingly drawn toward his twin sister, and Cersei lost the one person who had balanced Tywin's stern authority with warmth. The castle remained magnificent. Gold still flowed from the mines. Feasts continued in glittering halls, yet one quiet absence altered the emotional foundation of the entire family. It is tempting to imagine that Tywin simply ignored Cersei's intelligence because she was female, but the truth is more layered. He certainly underestimated what she desired. Time after time, he planned marriages that served House Lannister's interests, assuming Cersei's personal ambitions mattered less than political necessity. Yet he also allowed her to remain near the centers of power where she absorbed more than most daughters ever could. She watched disputes settled. She heard reports from King's Landing. She observed how wealthy houses negotiated with poorer ones. Every conversation became another lesson. Ironically, the very environment that denied her authority became the classroom that sharpened her political instincts. Now another question rises from the shadows. Did Cersei's future begin changing because of one old woman living near Lannisport, or because Cersei herself chose to believe every word that woman spoke? In both the novels and remembered accounts, the young Cersei visits Maggie the Frog alongside her companion Melara Heatherspoon. Maggie was no court prophet dressed in embroidered robes. She lived humbly, surrounded by strange smells, old herbs, and whispers that frightened children and intrigued nobles. There, according to Cersei's own memories in A Feast for Crows, the girl demanded answers about her future instead of waiting politely. Even as a child, she wanted certainty more than comfort. Maggie's prophecy has become one of the most famous in all of A Song of Ice and Fire because nearly every line echoes across decades. She tells Cersei she will marry the king, not the prince she expects. She hears that Robert Baratheon will father 16 children while she herself will bear only 3, each crowned with gold and wrapped in golden shrouds. Finally comes the darker promise that another queen, younger and more beautiful, will cast her down, and that the Valonqar will one day close hands around her pale throat. The language is deliberately mysterious. Martin never explains every meaning, and readers have debated each phrase for years. Yet the immediate consequence is unmistakable. Cersei leaves, believing the destiny has already written her life. An overlooked detail deserves careful attention. The prophecy itself does not command Cersei to become suspicious, jealous, or ruthless. It simply predicts events. The transformation happens inside her own mind. Every beautiful young woman becomes a possible rival. Every unexpected setback begins to resemble the opening move of fate itself. By trying to prevent the prophecy, Cersei often strengthens its hold over her decisions. This is one of Martin's favorite themes, appearing elsewhere in stories of dragons, kings, and ancient promises. Knowledge of the future rarely grants freedom. More often, it becomes another kind of prison. There is another fascinating contrast hidden here. Tyrion Lannister grows into adulthood believing that cleverness and adaptability can overcome almost any obstacle. Cersei gradually embraces the opposite belief. She comes to see history as something fixed, with enemies waiting behind every smile because prophecy has already identified them. Both siblings inherit Tywin's intelligence. Both become extraordinarily perceptive in different ways, yet one trusts reason first, while the other increasingly filters reason through fear. Their rivalry begins long before they ever argue openly in King's Landing. As dawn remains many hours away, the candle continues its slow descent, burning lower against the quiet darkness of the chamber. Somewhere beyond the walls of the Red Keep, the waters of Blackwater Bay rise and fall beneath the night wind, just as they did years earlier beneath the cliffs of Casterly Rock. A young girl once believed she could master every lesson her father never intended to teach her, and in many ways she succeeded. Before queenship, before Robert Baratheon, before the Iron Throne itself, Cersei Lannister had already learned the first law of her world. Knowledge was power, but only if no one noticed you gathering it. Why did Cersei spend her youth preparing to rule a kingdom that no one intended to let her govern? The answer lies in a contradiction at the heart of Westerosi society. Noble daughters were expected to embody grace, secure alliances, and strengthen their houses through marriage, yet many of them possessed political instincts equal to or greater than the men who inherited castles and titles. History had already offered examples. Queen Visenya Targaryen had advised Aegon the Conqueror. Queen Alysanne shaped the reign of Jaehaerys I through diplomacy and reform. Even the Dance of the Dragons, beginning in 129 AC, had demonstrated that women could command armies, dragons, and kingdoms, though often at dreadful cost. By Cersei's lifetime, however, those examples had become legends rather than precedents, and the customs of the Seven Kingdoms had settled firmly back into male succession. Cersei understood this before she reached adulthood. In her memories, she does not resent intelligence itself being valued. She resents that her own intelligence receives no acknowledgement simply because she was born moments after Jaime instead of before him. The twins shared tutors, shared games, and for many years, even shared ambitions. Jaime learned to ride and fight until few squires in the Westerlands could equal him. Cersei learned heraldry, genealogy, court etiquette, and the endless web of obligations binding great houses together. She quietly convinced herself that if the gods had merely exchanged their births, she would have become Lord of Casterly Rock, while Jaime lived a far easier life as a beautiful younger sister. Another puzzle emerges here. Why did Tywin, a man famous for recognizing ability wherever it appeared, fail to cultivate the daughter who resembled him most closely? The novels never provide a single explicit answer, but his actions speak clearly enough. Tywin believed institutions mattered more than individuals. Lords inherited lands, sons inherited lordships, daughters secured alliances. In his mind, personal brilliance could not overturn the structure that held the realm together. Ironically, this rigid belief blinded him to the possibility that Cersei could become far more effective as a political partner than as another carefully arranged marriage. The marriage Tywin desired first was one of the greatest prizes imaginable. While Prince Rhaegar Targaryen still lived, Tywin hoped to unite House Lannister with the royal family by marrying Cersei to the heir to the Iron Throne. The proposal never succeeded. King Aerys II Targaryen, whose relationship with Tywin had deteriorated over many years, rejected the match. By then, Aerys had grown increasingly suspicious of the man who had served as his hand for nearly 20 years. Some chroniclers even suggest the king feared Tywin's growing prestige more than any foreign enemy. Whatever his reasoning, the refusal humiliated House Lannister without requiring a single insult to be spoken aloud. For Cersei, that rejection became deeply personal. Rhaegar was everything the songs celebrated: handsome, scholarly, unmatched with the harp, and already carrying the melancholy that later generations would remember so vividly. He seemed the perfect prince from every tale sung across the Seven Kingdoms. Yet in the written canon, there is little evidence that Rhaegar himself ever pursued such a marriage. His eventual union with Elia Martell of House Martell strengthened the crown's ties to Dorne instead. The decision was political, not romantic, and it left Tywin looking elsewhere. Cersei, however, remembered the slight long after others had turned their attention to new matters of state. Then history accelerated. In 281 AC, the great tourney at Harrenhal gathered much of the nobility of Westeros beneath the vast towers of the ruined castle beside the God's Eye. Prince Rhaegar defeated Sir Barristan Selmy in the final tilt, only to crown Lyanna Stark the Queen of Love and Beauty, instead of his own wife, Elia Martell. Martin deliberately leaves many details surrounding Harrenhal shrouded in uncertainty, but every version agrees that this single gesture echoed throughout the realm. House Stark noticed. House Baratheon noticed. House Martell certainly noticed. Cersei noticed as well, watching another future disappear before it could begin. Here the listener should pause over a quiet irony. Cersei often believed herself uniquely cursed by destiny, yet countless noble families were simultaneously rearranging their futures according to events none of them fully understood. Brandon Stark still expected to marry Catelyn Tully. Robert Baratheon remained betrothed to Lyanna Stark. Jon Arryn continued holding together an alliance that would soon reshape the continent. Far away on Dragonstone, Viserys and Daenerys had not yet entered the world. Every house believed tomorrow would resemble yesterday. Almost none of them recognized that the final years of House Targaryen had already begun. The crisis erupted when Lyanna Stark disappeared with Rhaegar In 282 AC, the whether by abduction, mutual choice, or some more complicated truth, remains one of the central mysteries of the saga. Brandon Stark rode to King's Landing demanding justice and was arrested. Lord Rickard Stark answered the summons of King Aerys, expecting lawful judgment, only to die in one of the cruelest executions recorded in Westerosi history. Brandon strangled himself, trying to save his father from wildfire flames while Aerys watched. Those deaths shattered every remaining illusion that the Iron Throne still governed through reason. Even before armies gathered, the old order had begun collapsing from within. Tywin Lannister, remarkably, did not immediately join either side. This decision is often misunderstood by readers who remember only the dramatic sack of King's Landing. Throughout Robert's rebellion, House Lannister largely remained at Casterly Rock, while Jon Arryn, Eddard Stark, Robert Baratheon, and Hoster Tully carried the burden of open war. The decisive Battle of the Bells, fought around Stony Sept, the victory at Summerhall, and finally the Battle of the Trident, all occurred without Lannister banners leading the charge. Tywin watched carefully, measuring outcomes rather than emotions. Cersei observed him doing exactly that. Was this caution evidence of cowardice or extraordinary political judgment? The answer depends entirely upon whose banners you followed. Loyalists to House Targaryen could easily describe Tywin as opportunistic, waiting until one side had nearly won before choosing his allegiance. Supporters of Robert Baratheon might argue that preserving the strength of the Westerlands ensured stability after the conflict ended. Tywin himself never apologized. Results mattered more than appearances, and history usually remembers the victor's calculations more kindly than the loser's courage. Inside Casterly Rock, Cersei absorbed another lesson from her father, one that would shape nearly every decision she later made in King's Landing. Patience, when backed by overwhelming resources, could become a weapon as sharp as any Valyrian steel blade. You did not always need to strike first. Sometimes you simply allowed rivals to exhaust themselves while you preserved your strength. Gold remained in the vaults, soldiers remained rested, alliances remained flexible. It was a philosophy entirely unlike Robert Baratheon's directness or Eddard Stark's uncompromising honor, and Cersei never forgot it. As the night deepens beyond the walls of the Red Keep, the candle burns lower still, casting longer shadows across maps and ledgers that record the fortunes of kingdoms. Somewhere far to the west, beyond forests and fertile hills, Casterly Rock still stands above the sunset sea exactly as it did during those uncertain years. Within its golden halls, a young woman had begun seeing politics not as tournaments filled with glorious heroes, but as a board where the player who revealed their intentions last often lived the longest. Soon the realm itself would test that lesson, and Cersei would discover just how expensive wisdom could become when placed beside a crown. Why did Cersei ultimately become queen when her childhood dream of marrying Prince Rhaegar had vanished forever? The answer arrived through fire, rebellion, and one of the most decisive political reversals in the history of the Seven Kingdoms. By the closing months of 283 AC, Robert Baratheon had shattered Prince Rhaegar's host at the Battle of the Trident, where Rhaegar himself fell beneath Robert's warhammer in the Ruby Ford. King Aerys II remained inside King's Landing, surrounded by dwindling loyalists and increasingly consumed by paranoia. Dragonstone still belonged to House Targaryen. Queen Rhaella remained pregnant with Daenerys, and Prince Viserys had not yet fled across the narrow sea. Yet the fate of the dynasty had already been decided before the city gates ever opened. Tywin Lannister now made the decision that would define his reputation for centuries. Marching east with roughly 12,000 men beneath the crimson banners of House Lannister, he appeared before the gates of King's Landing claiming loyalty to King Aerys. Grand Maester Pycelle urged the king to admit the Lannister army, insisting that Tywin had come to defend the Iron Throne. Varys warned the opposite. The eunuch argued that Tywin never acted without calculating profit, and that opening the gates invited catastrophe. Aerys ignored Varys and listened to Pycelle instead. The great gates swung open, and with them closed the final chapter of nearly 3 centuries of Targaryen rule. The sack of King's Landing remains one of the darkest episodes in Westerosi history, precisely because it was so swift. Once inside the walls, Lannister soldiers abandoned any pretense of loyalty. Fighting spread through Flea Bottom, the Street of Flower, and the roads leading toward Egan's High Hill. Homes were looted. Innocents died alongside soldiers. Sir Gregor Clegane and Sir Amory Lorch entered Maegor's Holdfast, where Princess Elia Martell and her young children, Princess Rhaenys and Prince Aegon, met their horrific ends. Martin never softens these events, nor should we. They permanently stained House Lannister's victory with blood that later generations never forgot. Meanwhile, another drama unfolded inside the Red Keep itself. King Aerys ordered his pyromancer Rossart to ignite caches of wildfire hidden beneath King's Landing. These stores had been placed over many years beneath streets, towers, guild halls, and even beneath the Great Sept. The king's final command was not to save his capital, but to destroy it, believing that fire would transform him into something greater in death. Only one member of the King's Guard stood close enough to stop him. Sir Jaime Lannister slew Rossart before the order could be carried out, then turned his sword upon Aerys himself, ending the reign of the last Targaryen king to sit the Iron Throne. Here lies one of history's enduring ironies. Jaime's greatest act of heroism became the source of his greatest shame. The realm knew he had broken his sacred oath as one of the King's Guard. Almost no one knew why. Eddard Stark entered the throne room to find Jaime seated upon the Iron Throne itself, the dead king lying nearby. The image fixed itself forever in memory. From that day onward, he became the Kingslayer. Only many years later, in A Storm of Swords, does Jaime finally reveal to Brienne of Tarth the full truth about the wildfire plot. Had he obeyed his vows instead of his conscience, hundreds of thousands of people in King's Landing would likely have perished. Cersei watched these events from a very different perspective. Her family had not merely survived a civil war, they had emerged stronger than almost anyone else. House Baratheon possessed the crown, but House Lannister possessed wealth beyond comparison, an untouched homeland, and now enormous influence over the new regime. Tywin's gamble had succeeded almost perfectly. He had entered the war at its very end, suffered comparatively few losses, and positioned himself as the indispensable ally of the victorious king. To Cersei, this was confirmation that patience and calculation truly could defeat courage alone. Another question naturally follows. Did Robert Baratheon genuinely want to marry Cersei? Or was the marriage simply another necessity imposed by politics? The evidence points overwhelmingly toward the second answer. Robert had loved Lyanna Stark with an intensity that never truly faded, despite how imperfectly he understood the real woman behind his memories. Lyanna died shortly after the war at the Tower of Joy in Dorne, leaving Robert victorious but emotionally hollow. Jon Arryn, serving as Hand of the King and the kingdom's principal statesman, recognized that the new dynasty desperately required stability. No alliance offered greater security than binding the Iron Throne to the richest house in Westeros. Thus, Cersei became queen, not because she had won Robert's affection, but because both kingdoms required the appearance of unity. Their marriage joined House Baratheon and House Lannister in a political partnership powerful enough to discourage immediate rebellion. The wedding was magnificent, attended by the greatest nobles of the realm. Gold shimmered. Septons offered blessings beneath the seven-pointed star. Lords toasted the beginning of a new era. Yet beneath every smile lingered unresolved grief. Robert mourned Lyanna. Cersei remembered Rhaegar. Their marriage began not with shared hope, but with separate disappointments. The novels preserve a quiet conversation that reveals much about those early days. Cersei later recalls asking Robert on their wedding night whether he could love her. According to her memory, he answered by whispering another woman's name. Lyanna, he said in his sleep. Whether Robert consciously intended this or whether grief simply escaped him in exhaustion scarcely mattered. For Cersei, the wound became permanent. She entered the marriage believing she could still become the queen she had imagined. Instead, she discovered that she occupied a throne built partly upon another woman's memory. This single moment shaped decades of bitterness. Robert increasingly escaped into hunting, drinking, tournaments, and old comrades such as Eddard Stark, Thoros of Myr, and Sir Barristan Selmy. He proved brave in battle, yet careless in administration, leaving much of the kingdom's daily governance to Jon Arryn and the small council. Cersei observed every absence. She watched the king ignore council meetings, accumulate enormous debts to House Lannister and the Iron Bank of Braavos, and father children with women throughout the Seven Kingdoms. Each disappointment reinforced her conviction that she alone truly understood the seriousness of ruling. Yet fairness demands another observation. Robert was not the monster Cersei sometimes imagined, nor was Cersei the innocent bride later songs occasionally imply. Both entered the marriage carrying expectations the other could never fulfill. Robert sought a memory that no living woman could embody. Cersei sought admiration and partnership from a man whose heart had remained on the battlefield long after the war ended. Their failures fed one another year after year until affection became impossible. By the time Eddard Stark rode south in 298 AC, the royal marriage had long since become little more than a political arrangement maintained for the stability of the realm. As another hour slips quietly into the darkness, the candle's flame grows steadier, burning shorter but brighter against the polished wood. Beyond the chamber windows, King's Landing appears peaceful, its thousands of chimneys rising silently into the night air. Yet beneath those rooftops lies a city built upon compromises made after Robert's rebellion, compromises sealed with marriage vows instead of battlefield victories. Cersei believed she'd finally reached the center of power, She had indeed become queen, but she was only beginning to learn that wearing a crown and possessing real control were rarely the same thing in the Seven Kingdoms. Why did Cersei remain beside Robert Baratheon for nearly 15 years when affection between them had vanished almost from the beginning? The obvious answer is duty, but that explanation reaches only the surface. A queen of the Seven Kingdoms could not simply abandon her marriage, especially when the stability of a young dynasty rested upon the appearance of unity. Beneath the banners flying above the Red Keep, the realm expected heirs, continuity, and peace after the destruction of Robert's rebellion. Cersei understood that expectation better than most. She also understood that appearances, if carefully maintained, often mattered more than private truth. The first years of Robert's reign were in many respects remarkably stable. Jon Arryn governed as Hand of the King with patience and restraint, balancing the interests of houses Baratheon, Lannister, Stark, Tully, and Arryn. Stannis Baratheon held Dragonstone, while Renly Baratheon became Lord of Storm's End, despite Stannis believing the ancestral seat should have been his. Ser Barristan Selmy remained Lord Commander of the Kingsguard. Grand Maester Pycelle continued serving on the Small Council, joined by Varys the Master of Whisperers and Peter Baelish, whose talent for increasing royal revenues earned him the office of Master of Coin. To most of Westeros, the kingdom appeared prosperous. Harvests filled granaries, trade crossed the narrow sea, and tournaments replaced battlefields. Yet prosperity often conceals fractures invisible to ordinary eyes. Robert spent lavishly, borrowing enormous sums from House Lannister, the Iron Bank of Braavos, and wealthy merchants in the free cities. Littlefinger repeatedly assured the Small Council that the debts could be managed using complicated systems of loans, tariffs, and future borrowing. Tyrion later discovers that the crown owes millions of golden dragons, a burden far heavier than most lords ever imagined. Robert scarcely noticed. Hunting, feasting, and remembering lost battles interested him more than balancing ledgers. Cersei noticed every coin leaving the treasury because she saw waste where Robert saw celebration. Another mystery deserves attention. If Robert fathered children throughout the realm, why did Cersei never bear him a single acknowledged heir? The answer belongs among the most consequential secrets in the entire saga. In the novels, all three of Cersei's living children, Joffrey, Myrcella, and Tommen, are fathered not by Robert but by Jaime Lannister. Their golden hair, green eyes, and unmistakable Lannister features stand in striking contrast to the dark hair characteristic of House Baratheon. Centuries earlier, the union of Orys Baratheon and Argella Durrandon had begun a bloodline whose black hair appeared with extraordinary consistency. Jon Arryn eventually noticed exactly what everyone else had overlooked. This secret did not emerge suddenly. In 298 AC, it existed almost from the beginning of Robert's reign, protected by silence, status, and assumption. Jaime served as a knight of the King's Guard, living within the Red Keep itself. Cersei remained queen, their lifelong bond already unusually intense before the rebellion, continued behind locked doors and hidden passages. Martin never portrays this relationship as simple romance. It is possessive, obsessive, deeply intertwined with questions of identity and pride. Jaime often believes they are two halves of the same person, while Cersei increasingly expects complete loyalty from him above every other duty. To understand why this arrangement endured for so long, you must also understand how succession functioned in Westeros. Legitimacy rested not upon secret knowledge but upon public recognition. A child born to a lawful marriage was presumed legitimate unless overwhelming evidence proved otherwise. Very few people possessed both the courage and the authority to challenge the parentage of royal children. Lords saw golden-haired princes and princesses surrounded by Lannister relatives, yet no one openly questioned them. After all, Queen Rhaenys Targaryen had inherited her mother's Baratheon coloring generations earlier. Bloodlines were rarely as simple as songs suggested, there was, however, one man who quietly refused to stop asking questions. Jon Arryn had known Robert Baratheon since boyhood, raising him alongside Eddard Stark in the Vale. As Hand of the King, he possessed access to royal records unavailable to almost anyone else. Together with Stannis Baratheon, he began investigating the king's acknowledged bastards. One by one they found children scattered throughout King's Landing and beyond. Maya Stone in the Vale, Edric Storm at Storm's End, and the infant Bara in the capital among them. Different mothers, different circumstances, yet always the same dark Baratheon features. Eventually, Jon Arryn borrowed a massive genealogy, the lineages and histories of the great houses of the Seven Kingdoms, compiled by Grand Maester Mallion. Within those dusty pages lay the observation that changed everything. The famous phrase, "The seed is strong," echoes through a Game of Thrones, but it was never a magical revelation. It was a careful conclusion drawn from generations of recorded marriages. Time after time, Baratheon black hair appeared, regardless of whom they married. The children of Robert and Cersei stood alone in breaking that pattern. Jon Arryn died before he could present his findings publicly, yet he had already placed the pieces upon the board. His final investigation became the inheritance Eddard Stark would unknowingly receive months later. Cersei, meanwhile, was conducting investigations of her own. She never trusted the court simply because it appeared orderly. She watched Varys carefully, recognizing that his network of little birds heard conversations from kitchens, brothels, and noble chambers alike. She tolerated Littlefinger, but never truly understood the scale of his ambitions. She respected Jon Arryn's competence while quietly resenting the influence he exercised over Robert. Unlike many nobles, she rarely underestimated those who worked with information instead of swords. In this regard, she displayed genuine political insight. Intelligence gathering, she believed, mattered as much as armies. Yet Cersei consistently misjudged one crucial person. Robert Baratheon appeared careless, but his indifference itself protected him from many manipulations. He had little interest in ruling closely enough to become suspicious of every conversation. Instead, he delegated authority to men like Jon Arryn and trusted old friendships over calculated intrigue. Cersei interpreted this as weakness. In one sense, she was correct. Robert neglected the machinery of government. In another sense, she overlooked an important reality. A king who refuses to play every move on the board is also far harder to predict than one obsessed with constant control. The emotional distance between king and queen widened with every passing year. Robert, increasingly disappeared into hunting expeditions through the Kingswood, drinking contests with old companions, and tournaments where he could briefly remember his youth. Cersei withdrew toward her children and her Lannister relatives whenever they visited court. Their conversations became colder, interrupted more often by accusation than affection. Servants learned when to leave rooms quietly. Members of the King's Guard noticed the silence between them without daring to comment. The marriage continued because kingdoms required it, not because either participant believed it could still be repaired. Then another figure quietly entered the story, whose importance few recognized at the time. Petyr Baelish, born to the minor house. Baelish of the Fingers possessed no great castle, ancient army, or famous bloodline. Through accounting, charm, calculated debts, and a remarkable understanding of human greed, he made himself indispensable. While great lords measured power in banners and swords, Littlefinger measured it in obligations. Every favor created another invisible thread. Every loan bound another noble closer to him. Cersei saw that he was useful, but like nearly everyone else in King's Landing, she underestimated how dangerous usefulness could become when joined to limitless ambition. Outside the Red Keep, the city slept beneath clear skies, unaware that its future already rested upon hidden truths buried inside family trees, account books, and private chambers. Jon Arryn turned brittle pages by candlelight. Varys collected whispers from unseen children. Littlefinger counted debts that no one else fully understood. Cersei guarded a secret capable of igniting another civil war, convinced that only she possessed the resolve to protect her family from the world beyond the castle walls. The game had not yet become open conflict, but every important piece was already moving into position. Why, when Eddard Stark finally uncovered Cersei's greatest secret, did she not flee King's Landing before Robert returned from his hunt? At first glance, escape appears to be the safest choice. She knew that the truth about Joffrey, Myrcella, and Tommen could destroy House Lannister's influence overnight. She knew Robert Baratheon's temper better than anyone living. Yet she did not run. Instead, she remained in the Red Keep and calmly prepared for the confrontation. That decision, more than any speech she ever delivered, reveals how she understood power. The chain of events began with Jon Arryn's death in 298 AC. Officially, the Hand of the King succumbed to a sudden illness. Grandmaster Pycelle diagnosed a fever of the belly, and the court mourned one of the kingdom's most respected statesmen. Only later do readers learn that Jon Arryn had been poisoned with the tears of Lys by his wife, Lysa Arryn, acting under the manipulation of Petyr Baelish. At the time, however, almost no one suspected murder. Robert Baratheon simply turned to the oldest friend he trusted without reservation. He rode north to Winterfell to ask Lord Eddard Stark to become the new Hand of the King. Eddard accepted reluctantly. His instincts warned him against the journey almost from the beginning. Winterfell belonged to a different world than King's Landing. In the north, disputes were settled openly before bannermen. Honor carried practical value because families depended upon one another through winters that could last for years. In the capital, information itself became currency. Varys spoke in riddles. Littlefinger smiled while hiding intention several moves ahead. Renly Baratheon watched everyone with effortless charm. Pycelle offered advice that often favored House Lannister. Cersei observed the newcomer patiently, recognizing that Eddard possessed immense personal integrity but little experience navigating southern politics. One remarkable feature of Eddard's investigation often receives less attention than it deserves. He did not begin by suspecting Cersei. Instead, he sought to understand why Jon Arryn had died. Following scattered clues left behind by the previous hand, Ned visited the armorer Tobho Mott, where Robert's apprentice Gendry worked, without knowing his royal parentage. He questioned servants, searched records, and examined the same genealogy Jon Arryn had studied before his death. Every discovery pointed toward the same uncomfortable conclusion. Robert's bastards all resembled their father. Robert's supposed legitimate children did not. Meanwhile, Cersei was conducting calculations of her own. She had already sensed that Jon Arryn's questions before his death had not been random. She understood that Stannis Baratheon had quietly withdrawn to Dragonstone rather than remain at court after Jon's passing. She also noticed Eddard retracing many of the same steps. None of this escaped her attention. Unlike Robert, who often overlooked the details of court life, Cersei constantly measured who spoke to whom, which nobles traveled together, and which conversations abruptly ended when someone entered a room. She treated politics almost like hunting. Every unusual movement suggested hidden prey. Another question emerges here. Why did Cersei choose to admit the truth when Eddard confronted her privately inside the Godswood of the Red Keep? The conversation remains one of the defining moments of a Game of Thrones. Ned revealed that he knew Joffrey, Myrcella, and Tommen were Jaime's children. He urged Cersei to flee across the narrow sea before Robert returned, hoping to spare both her children and the kingdom from bloodshed. His proposal reflected his own deeply rooted sense of mercy. He remembered how innocent Targaryen children had died during the sack of King's Landing and refused to see history repeat itself. Cersei's response remains extraordinary because she neither denied the accusation nor begged for forgiveness. Instead, she acknowledged the truth with startling composure. She even confessed that Robert had fathered no living child upon her because she had ensured it would never happen. In the novels, she recalls one pregnancy by Robert that ended before birth, leaving her determined never to bear him another heir. Whether readers sympathize with her or condemn her, the scene demonstrates remarkable psychological control. Faced with exposure, she immediately shifted the discussion away from guilt and toward power. Then she asked Eddard one of the most famous questions in the series. When you play the Game of Thrones, you win or you die. There is no middle ground. The line has become iconic, yet its meaning is often misunderstood. Cersei was not celebrating cruelty for its own sake. She was describing what she genuinely believed to be the political reality of Westeros. Mercy invited destruction. Hesitation rewarded enemies. Every major house protected itself first because no institution stood above them to enforce lasting justice. In her mind, history repeatedly confirmed this lesson, from the fall of House Reyne to the extinction of the Targaryens in King's Landing. Yet here the contrast between Cersei and Ned becomes especially revealing. Eddard believed people remained responsible for their choices, regardless of circumstance. Cersei believed circumstance ultimately dictated every choice worth making. When Ned offered escape, he assumed compassion could interrupt the cycle of violence. Cersei heard only weakness. She interpreted his mercy as proof that he would never strike decisively enough to protect himself. Ironically, both understood each other correctly. Ned truly could not abandon his principles. Cersei truly would never abandon her children, regardless of the cost. Another figure deserves far more credit than he usually receives during these events. Sir Barristan Selmy remained one of the most respected knights in the Seven Kingdoms, serving faithfully on the King's Guard since the reign of Jaehaerys II. His loyalty belonged to the lawful king, not to House Lannister or House Stark. Had Robert survived long enough to hear Ned's accusation directly, Barristan almost certainly would have defended the king's lawful judgment. Cersei understood this perfectly. She therefore recognized that her greatest opportunity lay not in debating legitimacy after Robert returned, but in ensuring Robert never returned capable of making that decision. This brings us to one of the most carefully prepared plots in the early novels. Robert departed on a boar hunt in the Kingswood, accompanied by his brother Renly, Sir Barristan, Sir Meryn Trant, Sir Boros Blount, and numerous retainers. Lancel Lannister, Cersei's young cousin and Robert's squire, remained constantly at the king's side. Later evidence strongly suggests that Lancel followed Cersei's instructions to keep Robert heavily supplied with exceptionally strong wine during the hunt. Robert himself chose to pursue the boar, despite his intoxication. The animal mortally wounded him before being killed in return, leaving the king alive just long enough to return to the Red Keep and dictate his final wishes. Notice how carefully Cersei structured the situation. She did not openly murder Robert with poison inside the throne room. She did not arrange an obvious assassination by hired blades. Instead, she encouraged circumstances that amplified weaknesses Robert already possessed: his love of drink, his confidence as a hunter, and his refusal to retreat from danger. If fortune favored her, the hunt would solve her problem. If fortune did not, she retained plausible deniability. It was a cold calculation, but it displayed exactly the kind of indirect strategy she had absorbed from watching Tywin throughout her youth. Outside, the first faint breeze before dawn stirred banners high above the battlements of the Red Keep. Deep within the castle, ink dried upon Robert's final testament, while servants hurried through corridors, carrying messages they scarcely understood. One lord had offered mercy. One queen had chosen risk instead of retreat. Somewhere in the Kingswood, a dead boar lay beside the body of the king it had fatally wounded, and with that single hunt, the balance of power in Westeros began to shift more rapidly than anyone inside the castle yet realized. Why did Cersei defeat Eddard Stark so completely when nearly every advantage appeared to belong to him? He possessed Robert's written command, naming him Protector of the Realm. Until Joffrey came of age, he had the moral authority of the king's closest friend, the loyalty of his own household guard, and the truth regarding the royal succession. Yet within a single day, he lost his office, his freedom, and eventually his life. The answer was not that Cersei was stronger than Ned in every respect. It was that she understood one critical principle he refused to accept. Legitimacy meant very little if you did not first control the people carrying the swords. Robert Baratheon died surrounded by familiar faces inside the Red Keep. Before the end, he dictated his final will to Eddard Stark, naming him Protector of the Realm until my heir came of age. Ned quietly altered a single word, replacing "my son Joffrey" with the broader phrase "my rightful heir." It was a careful attempt to preserve the king's true intentions once Robert's children had been exposed as illegitimate. Lord Renly Baratheon immediately proposed a more direct solution. He urged Ned to seize Joffrey, Tommen, and Myrcella before dawn and secure the royal apartments with loyal men. Ned refused. He would not begin his defense of lawful succession by abducting children. Here the contrast between Renly and Eddard deserves closer attention. Renly was often dismissed by older lords as charming but politically shallow. Yet in this single moment he recognized the practical reality of King's Landing more quickly than Ned did. Whoever physically possessed the royal family would dictate the next stage of events. Renly was not speaking of slaughter. He envisioned protective custody until the succession could be resolved. Ned heard only dishonor. His decision reflected exactly the values that had guided him throughout his life, but those same values prevented him from adapting to the environment around him. Cersei, meanwhile, moved with remarkable speed. She understood that hours mattered more than speeches. Joffrey was proclaimed king. Almost immediately after Robert's death, the crown rested upon his head before the realm had any opportunity to debate his legitimacy. Royal authority, even disputed authority, carried enormous psychological weight. Messengers spread through King's Landing. Bells announced the death of one king and the accession of another. By the time many lords understood what had happened, the machinery of government had already begun operating in Joffrey's name. Another mystery has fascinated readers for decades. Why did Peter Baelish betray Eddard Stark after appearing to support him throughout the investigation? Ned believed Littlefinger would persuade Janos Slynt and the City Watch to honor Robert's final command. Earlier, Littlefinger had even arranged Ned's meetings with key witnesses, including Gendry. Catelyn Stark trusted him because of their childhood in River Run, yet Baelish never intended to place Eddard upon the throne as protector. Chaos served his ambitions far better than stability ever could. The betrayal unfolded inside the throne room itself. Eddard presented Robert's final testament before the assembled court. Cersei dismissed it calmly. Sir Barristan Selmy remained uncertain. Renly had already fled King's Landing during the night. Janos Slynt entered with the gold cloaks exactly as promised, but not to defend Eddard. Instead, Littlefinger stepped close enough to place a dagger beneath Ned's chin and quietly remarked, "I did warn you not to trust me." The City Watch turned their spears upon the Stark household, and the brief struggle ended almost before it began. The gold cloaks themselves are worth pausing over because they illustrate one of Cersei's greatest strengths. The City Watch numbered roughly 2,000 men, far more than the King's Guard or the Stark Household Guard. Their commander, Janos Slynt, owed his position not to noble birth, but to political favor. Cersei and Littlefinger understood that loyalty purchased through advancement could often prove stronger than loyalty expected through honor alone. Eddard assumed the City Watch would obey lawful authority. Cersei assumed they would obey the man who controlled their commander. She was correct. This moment often invites a difficult question. Was Cersei truly responsible for every aspect of the victory, or did Littlefinger deserve equal credit? The answer lies somewhere between the two. Baelish engineered the immediate betrayal because it aligned with his own long-term ambitions. Yet Cersei created the circumstances that made such betrayal worthwhile. She had already secured Joffrey's coronation, rallied Lannister supporters, and ensured that hesitation favored her rather than her enemies. Littlefinger exploited the opportunity brilliantly, but Cersei had already transformed the political landscape in which he acted. Ned's household fought bravely, despite impossible odds. Jory Cassell had already fallen days earlier during Jaime Lannister's attack in the streets, after Catelyn arrested Tyrion at the Crossroads Inn. Many of Ned's remaining guards died defending their lord within the throne room or during the fighting that followed. Sir Barristan Selmy, true to his vows, did not intervene without lawful command. The Kingsguard existed to protect the crowned king, and Joffrey now occupied that position in the eyes of the court. Duty became painfully complicated when legality itself had become disputed. Cersei now faced another challenge entirely. Winning control of King's Landing was only the beginning. News traveled slowly across Westeros, but when it arrived, every great house would interpret recent events through its own interests. Dragonstone still held Stannis Baratheon, who believed himself Robert's rightful heir under the laws of succession. Storm's End sheltered Renly, whose popularity among the Storm Lords exceeded his elder brother's despite his weaker legal claim. Winterfell would soon learn that its lord had been imprisoned. River Run, home of House Tully, would not remain passive while Catelyn's father and brother watched events unfold. Victory inside one city did not guarantee peace across an entire continent. Then came perhaps Cersei's greatest political miscalculation during these early days. She believed Eddard Stark could still be useful alive. The Queen favored sending him to the Wall, where taking the Black would remove his claim, satisfy many northern lords, and avoid creating a martyr. Varys quietly supported this approach, recognizing that mercy might reduce the chances of widespread war. Even Sansa Stark, desperate to save her father, publicly begged for clemency before the court. The arrangement appeared settled. Eddard confessed publicly to treason, accepting disgrace in exchange for his daughter's safety and the hope of peace. But one person refused to follow the carefully prepared script. King Joffrey Baratheon, young, impulsive, eager to demonstrate strength before the crowd gathered on the steps of the Great Sept of Baelor, suddenly ordered Sir Elend Payne to bring him Eddard Stark's head. The execution stunned nearly everyone present. Cersei herself immediately protested in the novels, understanding that the decision endangered everything she had tried to stabilize. Varys was horrified. Even members of the small council recognized the disaster unfolding before them. Joffrey had not acted according to careful strategy. He had acted according to wounded pride. This distinction matters enormously because later generations often attribute every Lannister action during this period directly to Cersei. Martin's books paint a more complicated picture. Cersei possessed genuine political skill, but she never exercised complete control over her son. Joffrey's cruelty repeatedly disrupted long-term planning. The execution of Eddard Stark transformed a dangerous political crisis into a continent-wide war. Robb Stark, already marching south after Tyrion's arrest and Jaime's attack, no longer had reason to negotiate. Stannis prepared his own claim. Renly gathered supporters. The War of the Five Kings had effectively begun. Morning light had not yet reached the highest towers, but the darkness over King's Landing no longer felt peaceful. Ravens waited in their towers, carrying messages that would soon spread across the 7 kingdoms. One command from a reckless young king had undone weeks of careful calculation. Cersei had won the capital through intelligence, patience, and swift action. Yet even as the Iron Throne seemed secure beneath House Lannister, the realm beyond its walls had already begun to burn. Why did Cersei survive the opening years of the War of the 5 Kings when so many rulers around her fell one after another? King Robert was dead. Eddard Stark had been executed. Yet the realm now faced 5 competing kings: Joffrey Baratheon in King's Landing, Robb Stark in the north, Stannis Baratheon on Dragonstone, Renly Baratheon in the Stormlands, and Balon Greyjoy upon the Iron Islands. Every raven that landed in the Red Keep seemed to carry another disaster. Defeat appeared possible from every direction at once. And yet Cersei, surrounded by enemies, refused to surrender even the appearance of control. The military situation deteriorated with astonishing speed. Jaime Lannister marched into the Riverlands to answer Catelyn Stark's seizure of Tyrion and to defend Lannister interests after Lord Tywin began devastating the lands of House Tully. Sir Gregor Clegane, Sir Amory Lorch, and Sir Adam Marbrand rode beneath Lannister banners, burning villages and drawing the River Lords into open conflict. Then came the Battle of the Whispering Wood, where Robb Stark, aided by Brynden, Blackfish, Tully, and careful scouting through dense forest, captured Jaime himself. Soon afterward, the Battle of the Camps forced Tywin to abandon the siege around River Run. Within weeks, House Lannister had lost its greatest battlefield commander to captivity. Inside King's Landing, Cersei suddenly found herself ruling without either Robert or Jaime beside her. Tywin remained in the field commanding armies. Jaime sat imprisoned at River Run. Tyrion had not yet arrived as acting hand of the king. Joffrey occupied the throne but possessed neither discipline nor patience. Tommen and Myrcella were still children. Every council meeting became a balancing act between experienced officials and an unpredictable boy king who believed wearing a crown made every impulse into law. Cersei could no longer rely upon powerful men solving every crisis beyond the city walls. Increasingly, she herself became the center holding the court together. Another fascinating contradiction appears here. Cersei often receives criticism for overestimating her own intelligence, yet during these months she repeatedly recognized dangers that others dismissed. She understood immediately that Stannis Baratheon represented the greatest legal threat because he was Robert's elder surviving brother. She also appreciated that Renly Baratheon's popularity among the Reach and Stormlands made him militarily dangerous, despite his weaker hereditary claim. Joffrey mocked Stannis as humorless and Renly as insignificant. Cersei did not. She knew that ambition backed by armies could not be laughed away. Then the political landscape shifted again through an event no strategist could fully predict. Near Storm's End, Renly Baratheon died suddenly, before the armies of his younger brother and elder brother ever clashed in open battle. In the novels, Brienne of Tarth witnesses a shadow bearing Stannis' features enter Renly's pavilion before the fatal blow. Melisandre of Asshai later confirms that blood magic played its part, though the exact nature of that sorcery remains one of the more unsettling demonstrations of magic in the series. Catelyn Stark escaped with Brienne amid immediate accusations of murder. Overnight, one king disappeared from the board without a conventional battle ever taking place. Cersei never learned the true cause of Renly's death, nor did she need to. What mattered politically was its consequence. Much of Renly's enormous host eventually passed to House Tyrell under Lord Mace Tyrell, while powerful bannermen such as Randall Tarley and Mathis Rowan reconsidered where their loyalties now belonged. The Reach possessed perhaps the richest harvests in Westeros and could field one of its largest armies. Whoever gained Tyrell support dramatically altered the balance of the war. At this stage, however, that alliance had not yet been secured. King's Landing still stood in profound danger. As the military threat increased, Tyrion Lannister finally entered the capital to serve as acting hand in Tywin's name. His arrival marked one of the most interesting periods in the entire Lannister story because brother and sister possessed similar intelligence yet fundamentally different methods. Tyrion distrusted nearly everyone immediately. He tested the loyalty of Grand Maester Pycelle, Varys, and Littlefinger by giving each man different false information regarding Princess Myrcella's proposed marriage. When only Pycelle repeated his version to Cersei, Tyrion confirmed that the elderly Maester reported directly to the Queen. It was a brilliant exercise in counterintelligence, revealing truth without public accusation. Cersei deeply resented Tyrion's growing authority, but her suspicions were not entirely irrational. Tyrion questioned many of her decisions while quietly building his own network of loyal servants, including Bronn, Podrick Payne, and the clansmen who had followed him from the Mountains of the Moon. He also took control of several aspects of the city's defense. Massive chains were forged along the Blackwater Rush. Thousands of jars containing wildfire prepared by the Alchemists' Guild under Hallyne the Pyromancer accumulated beneath careful supervision. Ballistae, scorpions, and siege engines appeared along the city walls. Tyrion saw the coming siege with remarkable clarity. Yet Cersei contributed something equally significant, though it is discussed less often. She focused relentlessly upon preserving the royal line itself. Tommen was eventually sent toward Rosby, and then farther from immediate danger. Princess Myrcella departed for Dorne under the escort of Sir Aerys Oakheart to fulfill the marriage pact with House Martell arranged by Tyrion. Cersei objected bitterly to sending her daughter away, but once the agreement became reality, she accepted the painful necessity. Even amid constant arguments with Tyrion, she never lost sight of what she considered the central purpose of queenship: protecting her children. Perhaps the most revealing episode of this period occurs not in council chambers, but inside Maegor's holdfast, as reports arrive that Stannis Baratheon's fleet has entered Blackwater Bay. Cersei gathered noble women and children inside the castle's strongest refuge while battle raged outside the walls. Present were Sansa Stark, young Tommen for a time, ladies of the court, and Queen Selyse's absent counterpart in memory. As fear spread through the hall, Cersei drank heavily, yet beneath the wine remained terrifying resolve. She openly declared that if Stannis breached the castle and victory became impossible, she would rather poison Tommen than allow him to be captured and used against House Lannister. Modern readers often recoil at that declaration, and rightly so. Yet within Cersei's own moral framework, it represented maternal devotion carried to its darkest extreme rather than simple cruelty. She remembered what had happened to Princess Elia Martell and her children during the sack of King's Landing. She understood what victorious armies sometimes did to defeated royal heirs. Better death by her own hand than humiliation, torture, or execution before enemies. It is a horrifying conclusion, but it follows consistently from everything Martin establishes about her fears, her family, and the world she inhabits. Outside those thick stone walls, the fate of King's Landing hung upon fire, floating across the black water. Tyrion led desperate defenders along the mud gate. Stannis' soldiers fought their way ashore beneath banners, displaying the crowned stag within the fiery heart of R'hllor. The great chain rose across the river, trapping ships exactly where the wildfire would burn hottest. Above the city, smoke rolled into the night sky until stars themselves vanished behind it. Cersei waited within the castle, surrounded by frightened children and flickering candles, prepared to lose everything except the one thing she believed no enemy would ever take from her willingly: her choice. Why did Cersei emerge from the battle of the Blackwater stronger than ever, only to begin losing control almost immediately afterward? Victory should have secured everything she wanted. Stannis Baratheon's assault had failed. King's Landing remained in Lannister hands. Her son still wore the crown. Yet the triumph also brought new allies, new obligations, and new rivals into the Red Keep. Cersei had survived the greatest external threat to her rule, only to discover that the next struggle would come from within her own family. The Battle of the Blackwater ended not through a single decisive blow, but through several victories arriving at exactly the same moment. Tyrion's great chain trapped much of Stannis' fleet inside Blackwater Bay. Wildfire engulfed ships in green flames that burned upon water itself, consuming sailors and timber alike. Tyrion personally led a sortie through the Mud Gate after Sir Mandon Moore attempted to assassinate him during the fighting. Then, as darkness covered the battlefield, fresh banners appeared beyond the city. Lord Tywin Lannister marched beside Lord Mace Tyrell, while Sir Garland Tyrell wore the armor of the slain Renly Baratheon, sowing confusion among Stannis' remaining forces. The battle broke, and Stannis withdrew to Dragonstone with only a fraction of the army that had crossed the bay. For House Lannister, the military victory was extraordinary. For House Tyrell, it was an opportunity beyond price. Highgarden had supported Renly until his death, but after his fall, Lord Mace Tyrell and his formidable mother, Lady Olenna Redwine, moved swiftly toward a new alliance. Marriage became the instrument of peace once again. King Joffrey's previous betrothal to Sansa Stark was dissolved, and negotiations began for him to wed Margaery Tyrell instead. The Reach brought food, wealth, manpower, and political legitimacy. In return, House Tyrell gained influence over the Iron Throne itself. Here another question emerges. Why did Cersei recognize the danger posed by the Tyrells almost immediately when so many others welcomed them as saviors? The answer reveals one of her greatest strengths. She judged people not by smiles but by incentives. Mace Tyrell enjoyed ceremony and honor, yet Olenna understood power with remarkable clarity. Margaery possessed beauty, intelligence, and an effortless gift for winning affection from both nobles and commoners. Sir Loras Tyrell stood among the finest knights in Westeros. Together they represented not merely another noble house, but an alternative center of influence capable of rivaling House Lannister inside the capital itself. The novels portray this rivalry with greater subtlety than the television adaptation. In the books, Margaery is younger than her screen counterpart, and her true political intentions remain more ambiguous because events are filtered through Cersei's increasingly suspicious point of view. Cersei interprets nearly every smile from Margaery as calculated manipulation. Whether every suspicion is justified remains uncertain. Martin deliberately allows readers to question how much arises from genuine Tyrell ambition and how much from Cersei's growing fear of Maggie the Frog's prophecy about a younger, more beautiful queen. Tywin Lannister returned to King's Landing at the height of his authority. The victory at the Blackwater transformed him once again into the indispensable architect of the realm. He resumed the office of Hand of the King, immediately imposing order upon a court that had become increasingly chaotic. Tyrion received little public recognition despite his central role in saving the city. Cersei, despite holding the capital together during the siege, also found herself pushed aside. Once Tywin entered the Tower of the Hand, decisions once again flowed through him. The queen remained influential, but she was no longer the dominant voice directing policy. This shift deeply affected Cersei because it reopened an old wound from childhood. Throughout her life, she had believed that she possessed the same political instincts as her father, while being denied equal respect because she was a woman. After the Blackwater, she expected acknowledgement for preserving the throne under impossible circumstances. Instead, Tywin resumed command as though nothing fundamental had changed. He negotiated marriages, distributed offices, rewarded allies, and disciplined opponents with his usual efficiency. To Cersei, it felt less like rescue than replacement. One conversation between father and daughter captures this tension perfectly. Cersei argued that she should serve as Hand of the King herself, believing she had already proven capable during the crisis. Tywin dismissed the idea almost immediately. He valued her as queen and as the mother of the king, but not as the chief administrator of the realm. His refusal was not shouted. It was colder than that. He simply behaved as though the proposal had never deserved serious consideration. For Cersei, every such dismissal confirmed what she'd believed since childhood, that Tywin saw her gender before he saw her abilities. Another consequence of victory received far less attention at first, but would shape future events profoundly. Tyrion, still recovering from the terrible wound inflicted by Sir Mandon Moore during the battle, discovered that many of his achievements were quietly being reassigned to others. Songs celebrated Lord Tywin. Lords praised the Tyrell cavalry. Court gossip admired Joffrey's courage despite the young king having abandoned the battlements during the fighting. Tyrion understood that history often belonged to those best positioned to write it. Cersei watched the same process unfold and drew a different lesson. Public image mattered every bit as much as military success, yet Tywin's broader strategy genuinely strengthened House Lannister in the short term. Sansa Stark was promised instead to Tyrion, binding Winterfell's claim to the Lannister family should the North eventually submit. Cersei herself was ordered to marry Sir Willis Tyrell, heir to Highgarden, thereby reinforcing the new alliance from another direction. She refused vehemently, arguing that she had already fulfilled enough political marriages. Tywin remained unmoved. The daughter, who had once resented being treated as a bargaining piece, discovered that even as Queen Dowager, in all but name, she remained one in her father's calculations. This moment reveals perhaps the greatest irony of Cersei's life. She spent years believing she thought exactly like Tywin Lannister, yet when Tywin applied the same ruthless logic to her future, she rejected it completely. To him, marriages existed to secure dynasties. Personal happiness scarcely entered the equation. That was precisely the philosophy Cersei had admired while it affected other people. When it threatened her own independence, admiration gave way to outrage. Intelligence alone could not overcome emotion, even for someone who prided herself on clear political judgment. Beyond the walls of the Red Keep, wagons from the Reach rolled steadily into King's Landing, carrying grain, wine, fruit, salted meat, and flour after months of shortage. The city celebrated survival. Bells rang once more, this time in triumph rather than alarm. But beneath the music and feasting, new alliances quietly reshaped the court. The enemy fleet had burned upon the Blackwater, yet another contest had already begun. One fought not with wildfire or swords, but with marriages, influence, and the slow struggle to decide who truly guided the young king upon the Iron Throne. Why did Cersei begin making her worst political decisions only after finally gaining the authority she had wanted her entire life? At first, the answer seems obvious: pride. Yet George R.R. Martin presents something more complicated. During Robert's reign, and even through much of the War of the Five Kings, Cersei rarely ruled alone. Jon Arryn limited royal excess. Tyrion challenged her assumptions. Tywin overruled her whenever necessary. Even Varys quietly corrected mistakes before they became disasters. Once those restraints disappeared, Cersei no longer needed to persuade anyone. She only needed to convince herself. The turning point came not with Joffrey's coronation, but with his death. In 300 AC, the wedding feast celebrating Joffrey's marriage to Marguerite Tyrell became one of the most infamous events in Westerosi history. Before hundreds of witnesses gathered in the throne room of the Red Keep, the young king collapsed after drinking poisoned wine. His face darkened, his throat closed, and he died in agony before his mother could save him. Readers later learned that Olenna Redwine, acting with Petyr Baelish, orchestrated the poisoning using the strangler hidden within Sansa Stark's hairnet. Cersei, however, saw only one suspect standing close enough to blame. She accused Tyrion immediately. To understand why, you must remember that this accusation did not emerge from a single moment of grief. It had been building for decades. Cersei blamed Tyrion for Joanna's death and childbirth. She distrusted his intelligence because it rivaled her own. She never forgave him for humiliating her politically while serving as acting hand. When Joffrey died, the possibility that another conspiracy existed scarcely entered her mind. Tyrion stood beside the king. Tyrion had argued with Joffrey publicly. Tyrion inherited generations of resentment before a trial had even begun. Another mystery lies beneath this decision. Why did Cersei ignore evidence pointing elsewhere when several details should have troubled any careful observer? Ser Dontos Haller disappeared immediately after the wedding. Sansa Stark vanished from the castle almost simultaneously. The poisoned chalice passed through multiple hands before reaching Joffrey. Sir Garland Tyrell, Margaery, and numerous servants stood nearby throughout the feast. None of these facts proved Tyrion innocent, but together they should have widened the investigation. Instead, Cersei narrowed it almost immediately. Certainty replaced curiosity. The trial that followed became one of the defining legal spectacles in King's Landing. Presiding judges included Lord Tywin Lannister, Prince Oberyn Martell of Dorne, and Lord Mace Tyrell. Witness after witness described Tyrion's sharp tongue, his quarrels with Joffrey, and his reputation for cynicism. Much of the testimony was technically true while simultaneously creating a profoundly misleading picture. Grand Maester Pycelle emphasized Tyrion's knowledge of poisons. Sir Meryn Trant recalled insults. Even Shae, once Tyrion's lover, appeared against him after falling into Tywin's hands. Cersei understood something fundamental about courts. Emotion often outweighed evidence. Yet the trial also revealed one of her greatest blind spots. Cersei consistently believed hatred and motive were sufficient proof of guilt. Tyrion certainly had reasons to despise Joffrey. So did many others. The king had humiliated noble houses, abused Sansa Stark publicly, threatened his own uncle, mocked respected knights, and delighted in cruelty. The list of potential enemies stretched from Dorne to the Reach. Cersei never seriously entertained those possibilities because they did not fit the story she already believed. When Tyrion demanded trial by combat, another old conflict resurfaced. Prince Oberyn Martell volunteered to champion him, seeking vengeance against Sir Gregor Clegane for the murders of Elia Martell and her children during the sack of King's Landing. Tywin accepted Sir Gregor as the crown's champion. The duel became far more than Tyrion's defense. It revived wounds dating back to Robert's rebellion itself. Oberyn fought brilliantly, repeatedly wounding the larger knight with a poisoned spear, but his desire to force a confession proved fatal. Gregor seized him, crushed his skull, and secured Tyrion's formal conviction. Then everything unraveled. Jaime, unable to watch his brother executed, secretly arranged Tyrion's escape with the help of Varys. Before leaving the Red Keep, Tyrion confronted his father inside the Tower of the Hand and discovered Shae in Tywin's bed. Shae died by strangulation with the Hand's golden chain. Tyrion then descended into the privy where Tywin Lannister sat and killed him with 2 quarrels from Joffrey's crossbow. The most powerful lord in Westeros died not upon a battlefield or beneath a castle wall, but in the most private room imaginable. House Lannister lost its greatest strategist in a single night. Why is Tywin's death so important to understanding Cersei? Because from that moment onward, she became exactly what she had always wanted to be. No father remained to overrule her. Jaime withdrew emotionally after returning from captivity and losing his sword hand. Tyrion had vanished across the narrow sea. Tommen, gentle by nature, looked to his mother for guidance rather than issuing commands himself. The small council still existed, but its strongest personality had disappeared forever. For the first time in her life, Cersei possessed something close to unchecked authority. Her early decisions reveal both brilliance and insecurity in equal measure. She recognized immediately that powerful men could become rivals. She therefore favored appointments based upon loyalty over proven competence. Orton Merriweather became Hand of the King despite limited political achievement. Oraine Waters, a handsome young knight with Valyrian features that reminded her of Rhaegar Targaryen, received command of the royal fleet despite lacking extensive naval experience. Qyburn, expelled from the Citadel for forbidden experiments, rose rapidly because he never questioned her judgment. Each appointment solved one immediate concern while quietly creating another. At the same time, Cersei's suspicion toward House Tyrell intensified. She watched Margaery charm King Tommen through kindness rather than intimidation. The young king enjoyed his wife's company. He laughed more often. He listened to her suggestions. Instead of recognizing this as an opportunity to stabilize the monarchy, Cersei saw only Maggie the Frog's prophecy unfolding before her eyes. The younger, more beautiful queen no longer existed merely in memory. She now walked the halls of the Red Keep every day. The castle itself seemed unchanged. Ravens still departed from the rookery at dawn. The Iron Throne still stood beneath its forest of twisted swords. Courtiers still bowed as the queen entered each chamber. Yet beneath those familiar rituals, something essential had shifted. The careful balance that once restrained Cersei had disappeared alongside Tywin's steady hand. At last she ruled according to her own instincts alone, convinced that every obstacle lay outside herself, never realizing that the most dangerous adversary she would ever face had begun speaking with her own voice. Why did Cersei willingly restore one of the very institutions that earlier kings had struggled for generations to restrain? Few decisions in her reign appear more surprising. The Faith Militant had not been a meaningful military force for centuries. Ever since King Jaehaerys I Targaryen carefully ended its long conflict with the Iron Throne, the warriors' sons and the poor fellows had once challenged kings themselves, forcing the Targaryens into years of bloodshed before reconciliation finally brought peace. Every educated lord knew that history. Every maester could recite it. Yet Cersei chose to reverse that settlement, believing she alone could direct the consequences. To understand her reasoning, you must first understand the political situation following Tywin's death. House Tyrell had become stronger with each passing moon. Margaery Tyrell now shared King Tommen's affection in a way Cersei never could. Sir Loras Tyrell commanded admiration throughout the realm. Lord Mace Tyrell occupied the office of Hand after Tywin's death, though Cersei privately dismissed him as vain and easily manipulated. Most importantly, the Reach supplied the food keeping King's Landing alive. Every loaf of bread reminded the queen that another great house now possessed leverage over the crown. Cersei searched constantly for methods to weaken that influence without provoking open rebellion. One opportunity appeared through the crown's enormous debts to the Faith of the Seven. The High Septon had died, and eventually a humble preacher known as the High Sparrow emerged as the new spiritual leader. Unlike many previous High Septons, he possessed little interest in luxury or courtly life. He walked barefoot. He slept simply. Thousands of common people admired his apparent sincerity. After years of war, famine, and noble excess, Cersei looked upon him and saw a man she believed gratitude could easily influence. Another question naturally follows. Why did Cersei underestimate the High Sparrow so completely when she had previously judged political opponents with such care? The answer lies partly in experience. Throughout her life, she dealt primarily with nobles motivated by land, titles, marriages, or wealth. The High Sparrow valued none of those things. His authority rested upon moral legitimacy among ordinary worshippers rather than military strength or inherited privilege. Cersei attempted to negotiate with him using the familiar currency of politics. He answered according to an entirely different system of values. The agreement seemed beneficial at first. In exchange for forgiving much of the crown's debt, Cersei restored the ancient military orders of the faith, the warriors' sons, composed primarily of noble knights, and the poor fellows, drawn largely from commoners. Historically, these organizations had defended pilgrims, enforced religious law, and at times openly defied kings. During the reign of Maegor the Cruel, they fought bitter campaigns against House Targaryen until Jaehaerys I resolved the conflict through diplomacy and careful legal reform. Cersei understood the history but believed circumstances had changed. She assumed the newly armed faith would target her political rivals rather than the monarchy itself. At almost the same time, she intensified efforts to undermine Margaery Tyrell. The Queen Dowager became convinced that Maggie the Frog's prophecy had already identified Margaery as the younger, more beautiful queen destined to replace her. Every conversation between Tommen and his young wife seemed threatening. Every compliment directed toward Margaery felt like another step towards Cersei's own downfall. The prophecy, once an occasional memory, had become the lens through which she interpreted nearly every event inside the Red Keep. Her methods reflected this growing obsession. She encouraged Sir Osney Kettleblack to seduce Margaery and then confess adultery before the faith. The plan depended upon false testimony supported by manipulated witnesses. Cersei believed the accusation would disgrace House Tyrell, separate Margaery from Tommen, and restore Lannister dominance over the court. It was an intricate conspiracy, but like several of her later schemes, it relied upon too many people remaining perfectly loyal under pressure. That assumption would prove disastrous. The High Sparrow investigated carefully, rather than accepting accusations at face value. Under questioning, Osney Kettleblack confessed not to relations with Margaery, but to entirely different crimes, including intimate relations with Cersei herself and participation in plots carried out under her instruction. Whether every detail of his confession represented the complete truth remains open to debate because torture and religious interrogation influence testimony in complicated ways. What mattered politically was that the faith now possessed sworn statements implicating the queen herself. The weapon Cersei had forged against House Tyrell suddenly pointed in her own direction. There is a striking historical parallel hidden within these chapters. Cersei admired Tywin because he believed institutions existed to serve House Lannister. Jaehaerys I, by contrast, had understood that institutions developed interests of their own. When he ended the Faith Militant uprising generations earlier, he did not merely defeat an enemy, he prevented future monarchs from facing the same challenge. By reversing his settlement, Cersei unknowingly reopened a conflict that wiser rulers had considered permanently resolved. Her intelligence remained formidable, but history proved longer than memory. At the same time, another mistake quietly unfolded beyond King's Landing. Orain Waters, the handsome admiral whom Cersei elevated to master of ships, largely because he resembled the young Rhaegar Targaryen, completed construction of a magnificent new royal fleet. Rather than remaining loyal, he sailed away with the ships after her arrest, declaring himself independently upon the stepstones. The loss deprived the crown of an enormous investment in ships, sailors, and treasure. It also demonstrated a pattern becoming increasingly common during Cersei's rule. She trusted appearances more readily than proven records of service. Soon the impossible happened. The queen herself was summoned before the faith. She expected negotiation, perhaps even deference. Instead, she found armed members of the warriors' sons and the poor fellows obeying the High Sparrow rather than the Iron Throne. The authority she believed she had granted remained beyond her control. She was arrested on charges ranging from adultery and incest to regicide and high treason. The woman who'd armed the faith to strengthen her own position now discovered that swords, blessed by a religion, did not answer to crowns. The stone corridors beneath the Great Sept felt colder than any dungeon Cersei had previously imagined for her enemies. Candles flickered before carved images of the Seven, while silent septas watched every movement. Above the city, bells continued marking the passing hours exactly as they always had, indifferent to queens and councils alike. Cersei had spent years mastering noble politics, marriages, armies, and succession. Yet in the end, one of the oldest forces in Westeros, faith itself, proved impossible to command, simply because she believed herself clever enough to do so. Why do so many readers remember Cersei as either a political genius or a complete fool when the books present something far more complicated? Few characters in A Song of Ice and Fire generate such sharply divided judgments. Some point to the downfall of Eddard Stark, the survival of House Lannister during the War of the Five Kings, and her instinctive understanding of power as proof of remarkable intelligence. Others focus upon the disasters of A Feast for Crows, where nearly every major decision weakens her own position. Martin intentionally gives us access to her thoughts during this period, allowing us to watch a brilliant mind slowly become trapped inside its own assumptions. The first truth is impossible to ignore. Cersei repeatedly identifies real dangers long before other characters do. She never trusts Varys, correctly recognizing that his loyalties lie beyond any single king. She sees Littlefinger as dangerous, even though she never fully understands his larger ambitions. She recognizes that the Tyrells seek influence rather than simple gratitude after the Blackwater. She understands that Stannis Baratheon's legal claim threatens Joffrey more than Renly's popularity ever did. These instincts are not accidents. They demonstrate a ruler capable of reading motives beneath polite conversation. Her greatest strength, however, gradually transforms into her greatest weakness. Cersei believes every relationship hides a conspiracy because so many genuinely do. In King's Landing, people lie constantly. Alliances shift without warning. Marriage proposals conceal political bargains. Smiles often precede betrayal. Under such conditions, suspicion becomes useful. But Cersei eventually reaches the point where suspicion no longer distinguishes between genuine threats and imagined ones. Once that happens, every conversation confirms beliefs she already holds instead of providing new information. Another question sits quietly beneath her entire story. Did Maggie the Frog's prophecy actually destroy Cersei's life? Or did belief in the prophecy shape every disastrous decision she later made? Martin never offers a definitive answer. The prophecy predicts that another queen will cast her down. It does not instruct Cersei to hate every younger noblewoman. It predicts that all 3 of her children will die. It does not require her to isolate them from capable advisors. It predicts the coming of the Valonqar. It never identifies that figure with certainty. Every attempt to escape fate seems instead to tighten its grip. This uncertainty is precisely what makes the prophecy so powerful as literature. Readers know the words, Cersei knows the words. Neither knows exactly how they will unfold. Some fans continue debating whether the Valonqar must be Jaime, Tyrion, another younger brother, or whether the prophecy itself conceals a more symbolic meaning. In the published novels, the answer remains unresolved. Martin consistently refuses to reduce prophecy into simple prediction. Instead, prophecy becomes a force acting upon human decisions, influencing behavior long before events themselves arrive. Book Cersei and television Cersei also begin diverging dramatically during this stage of the story. In the novels, Cersei ends a dance with dragons awaiting trial after her Walk of Atonement, while political authority in King's Landing grows increasingly fragmented. Kevin Lannister briefly restores order before Varys assassinates him, deliberately throwing the capital back into instability in preparation for Aegon VI's invasion. In the television adaptation, Cersei destroys the great sept of Baelor with wildfire, eliminates many rivals at once, and ultimately crowns herself queen. That spectacular sequence does not exist in the published books. The written canon leaves her future deliberately uncertain. This difference changes how audiences judge her intelligence. Television Cersei often converts ruthless decisions into lasting victories, at least temporarily. Book Cersei more frequently mistakes short-term satisfaction for long-term success. She humiliates allies who could have strengthened her. She rewards flattering advisors over experienced administrators. She assumes fear alone creates loyalty, when history repeatedly demonstrates otherwise. The contrast does not mean one version is superior. It means Martin and the adaptation chose different narrative destinations after the same starting point. Perhaps the fairest assessment is that Cersei truly inherited much of Tywin Lannister's political ability, but not his discipline. Tywin rarely allowed personal resentment to outweigh practical advantage. He disliked Tyrion deeply, yet repeatedly entrusted him with important responsibilities when necessity demanded it. He despised House Tyrell's growing influence but secured their alliance because the realm required it after the Blackwater. Cersei found such compromises increasingly intolerable. She wanted not merely victory but emotional vindication. The distinction seems small until kingdoms depend upon it. Jaime's changing perspective reinforces this idea beautifully. After losing his sword hand and enduring captivity with Brienne of Tarth, Jaime slowly begins questioning assumptions he carried since youth. His chapters reveal growing discomfort with Cersei's choices and with the identity they once shared. Earlier, he believed they were reflections of one another. Later, he realizes they have become profoundly different people. Their emotional separation mirrors the political fragmentation of House Lannister itself. The family that once appeared united behind Tywin now drifts apart in every direction. Meanwhile, beyond King's Landing, the wider world refuses to pause. Daenerys Targaryen rules in Meereen with 3 living dragons, the first seen in the world since the death of the last Targaryen dragons during the reign of Aegon III. At the Wall, Jon Snow commands the Night's Watch, while ancient threats gather beyond the haunted forest. Across the narrow sea, the young man presented as Aegon VI Targaryen lands in the Stormlands with the Golden Company. In Dorne, Prince Doran Martell quietly advances plans decades in the making. Cersei spends much of her energy fighting rivals inside the Red Keep, while entirely new forces reshape the future of Westeros beyond its walls. The candle that once illuminated maps of the 7 kingdoms now burns almost to its end, the flame shrinking until it barely pushes back the surrounding darkness. Looking across Cersei's life, the answer proves less simple than either her admirers or her critics often claim. She was perceptive enough to see dangers invisible to most rulers, bold enough to seize opportunities others feared, and intelligent enough to outplay formidable opponents. But she also became the prisoner of her own certainty. In the end, the sharpest mind in the room is not always the safest one if it eventually stops questioning itself. Was Cersei Lannister truly the smartest player in the Game of Thrones? Or did she simply understand one part of the game better than almost anyone else? By the end of the published novels, that question remains deliberately unresolved. George R.R. Martin has not yet completed Cersei's story, leaving her awaiting trial after the events of A Dance with Dragons. The final shape of her legacy still lies beyond the last printed page. Yet enough has already happened to understand why she continues to fascinate readers decades after her first appearance. Looking back across her life, one pattern emerges with remarkable consistency. Cersei rarely misunderstood what people wanted. She knew Robert wanted the memory of Lyanna Stark more than the companionship of a wife. She knew Littlefinger hungered for influence rather than honor. She recognized that Varys pursued purposes extending far beyond House Lannister. She correctly judged that the Tyrells would never remain satisfied with the role of grateful allies. She understood that Stannis Baratheon would never abandon what he believed to be his lawful claim. Time after time, her first reading of another person's ambition proved surprisingly accurate. Where she increasingly failed was in judging herself. This distinction separates wisdom from cleverness throughout Martin's world. Tyrion repeatedly questions his own motives even when he reaches painful conclusions. Eddard Stark accepts that his honor carries terrible costs, but refuses to pretend otherwise. Jon Snow constantly doubts whether he deserves command. Even Tywin, for all his pride, adjusts strategy whenever circumstances require it. Cersei grows less willing to revise her own conclusions with every passing year. Once she decides someone is an enemy, new evidence rarely changes her mind. Once she believes a prophecy explains events, coincidence itself becomes proof. That inward certainty explains why readers continue debating her intelligence. If brilliance means recognizing danger, she possessed it in abundance. If brilliance means adapting when reality changes, her record becomes far more uneven. The queen who calmly outmaneuvered Eddard Stark in King's Landing was not identical to the queen who armed the faith militant or trusted Arain waters with an expensive new fleet. The abilities remain the same. The balance between confidence and caution did not. There is another irony worth lingering over before the night ends. Cersei spent much of her life believing she had inherited Tywin Lannister's mind, while Jaime inherited his martial gifts. In some respects, she was correct. Both father and daughter understood intimidation, negotiation, and political leverage instinctively. Both believed family legacy outweighed individual happiness. Both could remain astonishingly calm during moments of crisis, yet Tywin consistently placed the survival of House Lannister above personal grievance, whereas Cersei gradually allowed personal grievance to define what survival itself meant. That subtle difference changed everything. Martin also refuses to make her merely a villain. Cersei commits terrible acts, many impossible to excuse. She orders killings, manipulates justice, and allows fear to justify cruelty. At the same time, she loves her children with unquestionable intensity. She genuinely believes she is protecting her family from a hostile world. She grows up inside a society that repeatedly tells her power belongs to men, regardless of talent. None of these truths erase responsibility for her choices, but together they create something far more compelling than simple evil. They create tragedy. The unpublished future adds another layer of uncertainty. Will Cersei survive her trial? What role will Sir Robert Strong, the silent giant created through Qyburn's forbidden experiments upon the dying body of Sir Gregor Clegane, ultimately play? How will Aegon VI's invasion affect King's Landing if his campaign continues succeeding in the Winds of Winter? Will Daenerys Targaryen arrive before those conflicts conclude, or afterward? Martin has left every one of these questions deliberately open. Unlike the television adaptation, the novels still hold many pieces in motion. Even the prophecy remains unfinished. The younger, more beautiful queen has never been definitively identified within the books. Many readers point toward Margaery Tyrell because Cersei herself does. Others argue for Daenerys Targaryen, whose dragons represent the return of the dynasty that displaced House Lannister. Some even suggest the prophecy's fulfillment could arrive through an entirely different woman not yet fully recognized. Likewise, the identity of the Valonqar remains among the most enduring mysteries in the series. Jaime, Tyrion, and other candidates continue to inspire vigorous debate because Martin carefully avoids confirming any answer. Perhaps that is why Cersei feels so strikingly human despite the castles, crowns, and heraldic banners surrounding her story. Most people are not destroyed by enemies they fail to notice. They are undone by strengths they begin trusting too completely. Courage becomes recklessness. Loyalty becomes obsession. Confidence becomes certainty. Cersei's intelligence never truly disappears. Instead, it slowly loses the companion that once made it effective: the willingness to doubt itself. The candle beside the window has almost nothing left to give. The last pool of wax spreads across the table where maps of Westeros lie undisturbed, their rivers and mountains unchanged by all the kings and queens who fought above them. Outside, Blackwater Bay reflects the first faint silver of approaching dawn, and the towers of the Red Keep stand exactly where they stood when our journey began. Somewhere behind those cold stone walls, a queen once believed she could see every move before anyone else. In many moments she truly could, But the final move that mattered most was never made by Tywin, Tyrion, Ned Stark, the Tyrells, or even prophecy itself. It was made quietly over many years. Each time Cersei Lannister became a little more certain that she could never be wrong. If you stay with Cersei long enough, you begin to notice that her story is not really about whether she was good or evil, wise or foolish. It is about what happens when intelligence grows without trust, when perception loses the habit of questioning itself, and when every disappointment hardens into certainty. Westeros rewards caution, yet it also punishes those who cannot recognize when caution has become fear. Wearing a wiser face, Cersei survives dangers that would have destroyed many rulers because she sees threats before they fully emerge. In the end, however, she also creates dangers that never needed to exist because she begins seeing enemies even where none have yet appeared. That quiet transformation feels deeply human, which is why her story continues to linger long after individual battles and betrayals fade into memory. George R.R. Martin's world rarely allows a single virtue to remain a virtue forever. Honor carries Eddard Stark to greatness, then to execution. Mercy saves lives, yet sometimes invites betrayal. Ruthlessness secures kingdoms, then poisons the families meant to inherit them. Cersei belongs perfectly within that pattern. The qualities that first made her formidable, her sharp observation, her refusal to underestimate ambition, her willingness to act while others hesitated, never disappear. They simply lose their balance. Every gift carried too far becomes another path toward ruin, and Martin returns to that truth again and again, whether he writes of kings, queens, knights, or bastards standing alone upon the wall. There is also something quietly tragic in how often Cersei mistakes power for safety. Throughout her life, she reaches one higher position after another. She becomes queen, then queen regent, then the central voice guiding young Tommen's reign. Yet every new victory leaves her feeling more isolated than the last. Wealth cannot silence prophecy. Castles cannot keep grief outside their gates. Armies cannot command love. Even the Iron Throne itself offers no lasting peace to those who sit upon it. The higher she climbs, the fewer people remain whom she truly trusts, until eventually, the only voice she believes completely is her own. Perhaps that is the deeper lesson you carry away from her journey. The Game of Thrones is never won by conquering every rival, because another rival always waits beyond the next horizon. Houses rise and fall. Dragons return after generations of absence. Winters lengthen, then finally give way to spring. Even the proudest dynasties become chapters inside larger histories, copied patiently by maesters whose ink outlives every crown. Legacy belongs not only to those who seize power, but to those who understand how briefly power can ever be held. And so we return to the quiet chamber where a single candle has burned through the long hours of the night. The wax has cooled upon the wooden table. Beyond the narrow window, Blackwater Bay lies still beneath the pale light before sunrise, and the towers of the Red Keep stand silent against the brightening sky. Somewhere inside those ancient walls, echoes of queens, kings, victories, and failures seem to settle back into the stone itself. You leave them there just as the dawn leaves the last small flame to fade, knowing that the stories of Westeros, like the seasons themselves, are never truly about who held the throne for a little while, but about what the throne asked of everyone who reached for it.